Welcome to my channel. Subscribe to the channel and listen to my stories every day. The first signs of trouble crept in on an otherwise ordinary Thursday afternoon. Claire, my wife of 11 years, was in the shower, and her phone, normally glued to her side, sat on the counter, buzzing softly with a message notification. The harmlessness of the situation was almost laughable, and I nearly ignored it. But then, as I glanced over, I caught sight of the message preview on her lock screen. Can't wait for tomorrow, beautiful. My heart jolted, and then settled into a hard, uneasy rhythm. There was no name on the message, only a number I didn't recognize. I took a steadying breath, brushing off the suspicion as a silly misunderstanding. Claire had friends, colleagues, people who could say something casual without meaning anything by it, right? Still, a nagging voice at the back of my mind wouldn't quiet down. Over the next few days, her phone stayed close to her, never out of sight. She would glance at it with a private smile, and she had a distracted air, as if something was occupying her thoughts. And then there were the late work meetings that she hadn't mentioned before. She'd return home after hours, claiming she'd stayed to help a new hire or prepare for a presentation. These were explanations I'd accepted with trust in the past, but now they felt strangely hollow. I began to notice things I'd once ignored: how she'd look away when I asked about her day, how she'd grow irritated over questions that were once simple exchanges. One night, just as I was letting it go, I found an upscale hotel receipt folded between papers in her purse. It wasn't a place we'd ever visited together. My throat tightened as I stared at it, my mind racing with 100 explanations that felt like they'd break me if they were true. But I was still only guessing. I thought I'd confront her, demand an explanation. But as the idea formed, something else pushed it aside, a plan, dark and thrilling, to turn the tables and make her feel the sting of deception she'd inflicted on me. So I tucked the receipt back, memorizing every detail on it, and began my own silent investigation. The next morning, I kept my cool, acting as though nothing had changed. I went about my day as usual, kissed her goodbye, and even made her a coffee before she left for work. But I wasn't planning on staying home that day. After she left, I called in sick to work, cleared my day, and drove to the hotel listed on the receipt. The drive felt like an eternity, each mile thick with doubt and anger that simmered, begging for release. My mind kept replaying every moment from the past few months, searching for signs I might have missed. The time she'd lingered a bit too long over her phone, or the faint, unfamiliar scent of cologne that I'd brushed off as a one-time thing. Now I couldn't ignore the possibility that she'd been leading a double life. When I reached the hotel, my heart was pounding so hard it was almost painful. I took a deep breath, steeling myself before walking in. I was just another face in the crowd, another visitor in a hotel lobby. Keeping my head down, I scanned the room with purpose, feeling ridiculous and desperate at once. A few minutes passed before I spotted her, seated in the corner of the lobby, chatting casually with a man I recognized from one of her work events. They were laughing together, their heads close, his hand resting casually on the back of her chair. I felt a pang in my chest, sharp and blinding. This wasn't work, and it was certainly no innocent meeting. Watching them, I felt 100 different things, none of them pleasant. But I forced myself to keep watching, every second cementing the reality of her betrayal. They finished their coffee, exchanged a look that needed no words, and stood to leave. As they headed toward the elevators, I turned, making my way out of the hotel. I'd seen enough for now. I didn't want a scene, didn't want to give her the satisfaction of a confrontation. Instead, I drove home, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I tried to contain the rising fury. Once home, I sat in silence, replaying everything I'd seen. A part of me wanted to scream, to destroy something. But that would be too easy. I needed a plan, a way to make her feel the weight of her choices. My mind spun with possibilities, each more satisfying than the last. She thought she could lie to my face, keep her life with me while indulging in her fling on the side. She thought she was untouchable. I decided I'd give her a dose of reality she'd never forget. The next morning, I woke up early, forcing myself to act normal. She returned home, her eyes slightly puffy, though she managed a casual smile. I greeted her with a kiss and even pretended not to notice when she flinched, her guilty conscience showing in a split-second reaction. I made her breakfast, watching her carefully, feeling like a hunter eyeing his prey. The more she pretended, the more I hardened inside. She thought she could fool me, that I'd never catch on. When she headed off to work, I began the final stage of my plan. I set up a burner phone number and saved it in her phone's contact list under the name of her work's HR director. Then, I drafted a message that would strike right at her core: "Claire, please prepare your personal belongings by noon. HR will be conducting a review on grounds of misconduct." Satisfied, I programmed it to send later that night, after she'd had a full day of acting like nothing was wrong. All day, I anticipated her reaction, my anger sharpening every time I thought of the lies she told me. She'd made her choice. The burner phone buzzed right on time, sending the carefully crafted text to Claire as she sat in the living room, unwinding after work. I was in the kitchen, pretending to scroll through emails on my phone, every nerve on high alert, waiting for her reaction. The ding of her phone was soft, almost imperceptible, but I didn't need to hear it to know that everything was about to shift. From the corner of my eye, I saw her pick up her phone, the light-hearted calm slipping from her face as her eyes narrowed. I could almost feel the panic rise within her as she reread the message. She stared at the screen, frozen, her fingers hovering as though she didn't know whether to type a reply or throw the phone across the room. I took a moment to savor the sight of her unraveling in real time. It was ironic, I'd once looked at this woman with nothing but love, trusted her without question. Now, seeing her squirm was the most satisfying feeling I'd had in months. Finally, she gathered herself, letting out a shaky breath as she tapped out a quick response. I watched her phone, my heart drumming with a new excitement, knowing she was frantically trying to play damage control, oblivious to the fact that the only person at the other end was me. Her response was brief, probably designed to sound professional, but beneath it, I could sense her desperation. "I don't understand. Misconduct? Can we discuss this in person?" The beauty of it was in the simplicity. All I had to do now was maintain her sense of impending doom, keep the mystery hanging in the air long enough for her to start unraveling on her own. I took my time, allowing her to sit with her fear, letting her build her own narrative of what might be coming. She tried to keep her cool for the rest of the night, but her usual ease was gone. Even as we had dinner, I could feel her distracted, barely tasting the food on her plate as she nervously checked her phone every few minutes. I made small talk, feigning ignorance, and asked about her day. She mumbled vague answers, her eyes darting to the phone every time it chimed, her mind clearly occupied. Once the dishes were cleared, I turned on the TV, flicking through channels, pretending to be absorbed in some random program. Claire sat on the other end of the couch, her shoulders hunched as she stared off into space, twisting her fingers in her lap. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. I waited until she excused herself to the bathroom to check the burner phone and saw the messages piling up. Her texts were a stream of anxious questions and urgent requests for clarity. What have I done wrong? Please clarify. Can we discuss this tomorrow morning? And finally, after a long pause, please, this is a misunderstanding. I've been a loyal employee for years. I knew she'd be desperate enough by now for something more direct. So I sent a response that would feed her fears perfectly: "We'll discuss everything at your review tomorrow. You'll have the chance to explain yourself then." The vagueness would make her imagine the worst, as though her entire life were on trial. When she came back into the living room, her face was pale, her movements stiff. She tried to sit with me, her eyes flicking toward mine, as if hoping to find some sense of reassurance, maybe even some sympathy. But instead of her usual ease, there was an awkward tension between us, a discomfort she hadn't expected. I could tell she was holding back from spilling everything, weighing whether or not she should mention the message from HR. Maybe she hoped I wouldn't have to know, that somehow she could keep everything under wraps until this supposed review was over. I decided to bait her a little, keep her off balance. "Everything all right, Claire?" I asked, keeping my tone casual, almost bored, as if nothing were out of the ordinary. "You've been on your phone all night." She snapped her head up, a nervous smile forcing its way to her lips. "Oh, yeah, just work stuff, you know. Just a lot going on." Her laugh was thin, brittle. "They're keeping us busy as usual." "Really?" I replied, raising an eyebrow. "Funny, you seem kind of distracted." The corners of her mouth twitched, her eyes widening ever so slightly, betraying that flicker of panic she was trying to suppress. "No, it's nothing. Just one of those days." She brushed it off with a laugh that sounded hollow, a far cry from her usual carefree confidence. But I wasn't letting her off that easy. "Well," I said, settling back, "just remember, I'm here if you ever need to talk about anything. You seem stressed lately." "Yeah, thanks," she murmured, her gaze falling to her hands. For a second, I thought she might confess right then and there. But she quickly shut her mouth, plastering on a weak smile as she leaned back into the couch, visibly forcing herself to relax. The night dragged on in an uncomfortable silence. I could see she was barely holding it together, every chime of her phone a jolt to her already fraying nerves. It felt like I was watching a building on the verge of collapse, and all it would take was one more nudge to bring it crashing down. When she finally went to bed, she left her phone on the nightstand, and I could see the glow of notifications flashing. I knew I had her. I just had to push her a little further. The next morning, I woke up early, watching as she dressed for work. She looked distracted, almost robotic, as she slipped on her blazer and grabbed her phone, her gaze distant. She muttered a quick goodbye, barely glancing at me as she headed for the door. I wished her a good day, watching her leave with a strange sense of satisfaction. Today was the day it would all come crashing down. Once she was gone, I sent one final message to the burner phone, reinforcing the sense of impending doom that had been hanging over her since last night. "Please be prompt for your review at 10 a.m. in HR." Then I put the burner phone away, deleting the messages and ensuring there was no trace left behind. I'd crafted the perfect storm, and now it was time to watch it unfold. Hours later, I received a text from Claire. She'd finished her meeting, or whatever she'd managed to invent to explain her frantic scrambling, and I could feel her desperation in the text. "Can we talk later? I need to explain something." Her tone wasn't just panicked, it was resigned. I could picture her, finally beaten down, ready to confess everything. I spent the afternoon preparing, letting the tension build, relishing the thought of finally hearing her excuses, her desperate attempts to justify everything. When she came home that evening, she looked like she'd been through hell. Her face was pale, her hair disheveled, and the confidence that had once defined her was completely shattered. She stood in the doorway, her eyes pleading as she looked at me. "Can we talk?" she whispered. I nodded, gesturing for her to sit. She took a seat across from me, her hands twisting nervously in her lap as she struggled to meet my eyes. For the first time, I saw real fear in her gaze, a vulnerability she'd never shown before. I need to tell you something," she began, her voice trembling. She looked down, taking a shaky breath before finally meeting my gaze. There's something I haven't been honest about." The satisfaction I felt in that moment was indescribable. All the anger, the betrayal, it felt like it was finally being answered, balanced by her own confession. Claire looked at me, her hands knotted together, her lips trembling as though she were struggling to form the words. For a moment it was almost too much, seeing her so stripped of the confidence she'd worn like armor for as long as I'd known her. But I pushed down any remnants of pity, reminding myself of the endless lies, the countless ways she'd betrayed my trust. Her gaze flickered, and I could see she was trying to decide how much to reveal. Finally, with a breath that sounded as if it might shatter her, she started talking. "Mark," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I haven't been honest with you. About a lot of things." She swallowed hard, her fingers gripping her knees as if she might break if she let go. "It's not that I don't love you," she continued, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. I was lonely, and I was stupid. Lonely. The word felt like an insult, a slap in the face. I'd spent years working hard, being there for her, providing, trusting that she'd always do the same for me. And now she was sitting here, using loneliness as an excuse. I held my tongue, letting her squirm, letting her think she could justify herself. She took my silence as permission to continue. "It started as just a few messages, here and there," she admitted, her eyes darting away from mine. "It wasn't supposed to be anything serious. I didn't think it would go as far as it did." The ache in my chest pulsed again, but I forced myself to stay still, to keep the fury at bay as I listened. I needed her to confess, to finally reveal everything she'd hidden, all the secrets she thought she could keep from me. But now, under the weight of guilt and fear, she was unraveling. She lowered her gaze to her hands, and her words came faster, almost like she was trying to get it over with. "I thought it was harmless," she whispered. "I was an idiot for thinking that. I know it doesn't excuse anything, but I need you to know it wasn't about you." She paused, her shoulders slumping. "It was me, my own weaknesses. My own weaknesses." Another hollow excuse. She wanted me to believe that this was all some unavoidable flaw of hers, some mistake she couldn't help but make. But she'd had plenty of chances to stop, to come clean. Yet she hadn't. She'd chosen to live in that lie and leave me in the dark. Still, I bit back the retort that simmered on my tongue and simply nodded, urging her to continue. "It started about a year ago," she said, her voice barely audible. "At first, it was just coffee after work. Then, dinners." She looked down, her hands twisting together, her knuckles white. "And eventually, it turned into more. He made me feel like I was still interesting, still attractive." She stopped, her voice catching. The way she spoke, as though her affair were somehow a gift bestowed upon her, made my skin crawl. It was a betrayal that cut deep, but she was describing it like a necessary indulgence, something that helped her cope with her insecurities. I fought the urge to laugh, to tell her just how warped and self-serving her version of the story sounded. When she glanced up at me, her eyes were wide, pleading, as though she expected some sort of sympathy, some absolution. But I wasn't about to give her that satisfaction. "Who was he?" I asked, my tone colder than I'd intended. I'd known the answer the moment I saw them in the hotel lobby, but I wanted to hear her say it. I wanted her to acknowledge the full weight of her choices, the man she'd let into our lives under the guise of a colleague. She looked away, her face tightening. It doesn't matter who he was," she stammered, clearly hoping I'd let her dodge the question. "He's not important. It was a mistake, one I'll never make again. I want us to move past this." "Doesn't matter who he was?" I repeated, leaning forward, my voice dropping to a near growl. "Really, Claire? Doesn't matter that he sat across from me at dinners, shook my hand, acted like a friend? That doesn't matter to you?" Her face drained of color, and I knew she understood the depths of my anger. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. She'd been caught in her own trap, and for once, there was no way out. "Tell me his name," I demanded, my voice steady but sharp. She hesitated, and I could see the shame in her eyes, the fear of losing the last shred of dignity she thought she had. But this time, I wasn't letting her hide behind half-truths. "Matthew," she whispered, barely loud enough for me to hear. "His name is Matthew. He works in my department." The words hung in the air, heavy and damning. She looked down, her face shadowed by guilt, her shoulders slumped. Matthew. The man who'd been at our last work party, the man who'd stood there laughing with me, pretending to be nothing more than a casual acquaintance. I clenched my fists, the anger roaring back to life, but I kept my expression blank, determined to maintain the upper hand. She continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I ended things with him months ago, Mark. I swear, it's over. I realized what I was risking, what I was throwing away. I didn't want to hurt you, I swear. A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. Didn't want to hurt me? I echoed, my voice low, dangerous. Well, Claire, you succeeded in that for quite a while, didn't you? You hid it well enough, managed to live with the lie. Her eyes were filled with tears now, her hands trembling. Mark, please. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But please, can we try to work this out? I'll do anything. I leaned back, folding my arms as I regarded her. Anything? She nodded desperately, her eyes wide, clinging to whatever shred of hope she thought might remain. Yes, anything. I just want to make things right. I watched her, taking in her desperation, her fear. She thought she could still save this, thought that somehow, I'd forgive her. But forgiveness wasn't on my mind. All right, I said slowly, a cold smirk pulling at the corner of my mouth. Then here's what you're going to do. Tomorrow, you're going to call HR and let them know that you're resigning. Effective immediately. Her face twisted in confusion, the panic rising as my words sank in. What? Mark, no, that's. You said you'd do anything, I interrupted, my voice ice cold. You've turned our marriage into a lie. You've used your job as an excuse for your affair. So you're going to give it up. You can stay here until you find another one, but you're not going back there. Not with him. Her face paled, and I could see the panic building. Mark, that's my career. I worked hard to get where I am. Please, I can keep things professional. I don't even talk to him anymore. I shook my head, my gaze unwavering. No, Claire. If you want any chance of saving what's left of this marriage, you're going to quit. You can find a job somewhere else, somewhere he's not. If it's so easy to walk away from him, this should be no problem for you. She was silent, her gaze fixed on the floor, the weight of her choices finally settling on her shoulders. I could see the defiance building, the urge to argue, to resist, but she swallowed it down, nodding with reluctant acceptance. Fine, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'll quit. If that's what it takes, I'll quit. I nodded, my gaze hard. Good. And if I catch you lying to me again, Claire, it's over. I won't give you another chance. She flinched, the reality of her actions hitting her with full force. I stood up, feeling the satisfaction of having reclaimed control, of making her pay even a fraction of the price she owed. As I turned to leave the room, I heard her stifle a quiet sob, the sound like a strange, twisted form of victory. But I felt no pity. The damage was done, and for the first time, she understood that. Claire quit her job the next day, just as I demanded. I watched her hand over the resignation letter she'd typed, her hands trembling slightly as she placed it in an envelope and sealed it, her eyes misty but determined. She'd made the calls, submitted the paperwork, and handed over her ID badge without a word of protest. I should have felt satisfaction, relief maybe, knowing she'd made the choice I demanded. Yet, as the days passed, the victory I'd anticipated felt strangely hollow. The anger I'd nursed so carefully was dimming, replaced by a weight that settled low in my chest. I'd held on to my fury as if it were armor, but now, with Claire's betrayal fully out in the open, my mind was plagued by memories of the life we'd once shared. The house felt quieter, like a shadow of what it had been, each room haunted by what we'd lost. Claire had started working part-time at a small non-profit, but it wasn't the same. I could see it in her, the restlessness, the doubt, as if she were constantly on edge, waiting for the next wave to crash. She tried hard to make things right, spending hours repairing every little crack in our life together. And yet, I could see the exhaustion in her, the weight of shame she wore like a shroud. One evening, I found her sitting on the back porch, staring out at the darkening sky, her shoulders hunched. I approached quietly, leaning against the door frame, watching her in silence. For a moment, I wondered if we could ever reclaim what we'd had, if time and penance could somehow rebuild the wreckage she'd left. But deep down, I knew the answer. Too much had broken, and even her efforts to bridge the distance between us felt forced, stilted, a fragile thing bound to shatter with the slightest misstep. She looked up, startled by my presence, her eyes red-rimmed. She gave me a small, sad smile, patting the spot next to her. "Want to sit?" I nodded, taking a seat beside her, neither of us speaking for a long time. The silence was heavy, a gulf neither of us knew how to cross. Finally, she broke it. "Mark. I know you don't trust me, and I don't know if you ever will," she said quietly, her gaze fixed on some point in the distance. "But, thank you for giving me the chance to try. I know I don't deserve it." I looked at her, taking in the quiet sincerity in her voice. She looked so fragile, so worn down by everything she'd put herself, and us, through. I wanted to believe her, to let go of the bitterness that had lodged itself in my heart. But the memory of her betrayal was seared too deep. I looked away, unable to give her the answer she was hoping for. We sat like that until the stars began to dot the night sky, the quiet settling between us once again. She reached out, her hand brushing mine, and I didn't pull away. We stayed like that, fingers barely touching, as if afraid that the slightest movement would break whatever fragile truce had formed between us. The next morning, Claire left early. She'd picked up an extra shift at the non-profit, eager to throw herself into something, anything, that might give her a sense of purpose. I didn't mind. The house felt like a refuge without her presence, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to relax. But hours passed, and by evening, Claire hadn't returned. I checked my phone, expecting a message, a voicemail, anything to let me know where she was. But there was nothing, just the quiet ticking of the clock, counting down the minutes of her absence. By midnight, worry gnawed at me. I tried calling, but each attempt went straight to voicemail. I sat in the living room, every sound magnified by the silence, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't suppress. Anger, fear, regret, all of it coiled within me, tightening with each passing minute. Finally, the call came. My phone buzzed in the dark, the screen glowing with a number I didn't recognize. I answered quickly, my heart pounding. "Mr. Fisher," the voice on the other end asked, hesitant. "Yes, this is Mark," I replied, my voice unsteady. "This is Officer Jacobs with the city police. We have a woman here, Claire Fisher, listed as your spouse. I'm afraid there's been an accident." The words hit like a blow, leaving me breathless, stunned. I barely registered the details as he continued, explaining in clinical terms what had happened. She'd been driving home late, the road slick with rain, when her car skidded and collided with a barrier. She hadn't been wearing her seatbelt, and the impact. The officer's voice trailed off, a polite silence filling the line as he waited for my response. But I had nothing. The world felt hollow, the silence suffocating. I thanked him, numb, and hung up, sitting in the darkness as the reality settled in. Claire was gone. In the days that followed, I moved through life in a daze. The funeral was a blur, a procession of faces and whispered condolences that barely registered. I heard fragments of conversations, caught glimpses of sympathy in the eyes of people who had no idea what our life had truly been like. They saw a grieving husband, but they couldn't see the truth, the bitterness and resentment that had filled the last days of our life together. And yet, in the hollow quiet of my empty house, I was haunted by memories I couldn't escape. Every room bore the echoes of our past, the laughter we'd once shared, the plans we'd made, the life we'd built and then broken. I realized, too late, that for all the anger I'd felt, I'd never truly let go of the love I'd once had for her. It had been buried beneath the pain and betrayal, but it was still there, a quiet ache I'd ignored until it was too late. One night, as I sat alone in our bedroom, I found a letter tucked into the drawer of her nightstand, sealed in an envelope with my name scrawled across it. My hands shook as I opened it, reading the words she'd written, a letter she must have left there in case she ever lost the chance to say goodbye. "Mark," she'd written, "I don't know if you'll ever read this, but if you do, I hope you understand how deeply sorry I am. I know I can never make up for the hurt I've caused, but I want you to know that I loved you, even in my worst moments. I wish I could take back every mistake, every lie, and give us a second chance. Please remember the good times we had, the love that was once there. You deserved better than what I gave you, and I'll carry that regret forever. Thank you for letting me stay, even when you had every right to walk away. I hope one day you find peace, even if I'm not there to see it." I set the letter down, my hands trembling, the words blurring as tears filled my eyes. The pain was sharper now, a piercing regret that twisted inside me, a regret that I'd never find a way to resolve. I'd thought revenge would bring me peace, that seeing her suffer would balance the scales. But now, with the house empty, her voice silenced forever, I understood too late that no amount of justice or punishment could ever bring back what I'd lost. And as I sat there, the loneliness pressed in, a relentless weight, filling every corner of my heart with a sadness I knew I'd carry for the rest of my life.